Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to those of you who I can see connecting to our event by audio this afternoon. My name is Nick Pearce, and I am the Director of the Institute for Policy Research at the University of Bath. And my screen tells me that a number of you are still trying to get into the meeting, so I shall slow down my introductions as you do so. This event, this online event, is to host the launch of a report that my colleagues at the Institute have been undertaking in recent weeks and months called Uncharted Territory, Universal Credit, Couples and Money. This is part of an ESRC funded project, Couples Balancing Work, Money and Care, exploring the shifting landscape under universal credit. It's a 3-year longitudinal qualitative research study, and it looks at how couples with and without children make decisions about work, care, and household finances in relationship to the changes brought about by universal credit. As people will know, universal credit is a big reform. It replaces 6 means-tested benefits and tax credits, some big and complicated changes, and those are some of the issues that we've been exploring in this research, focusing on design and payment issues affecting couples with or without children, as I say. Today, what we're going to do is hear from our report's authors, from the research team, and then there will be opportunity for plenty of debate and discussion. We can take questions. Please do submit those via the chat function later on, and then we will respond to those questions, put those to our report authors. The first of my colleagues I'm going to introduce is Rita Griffiths, who's a research fellow at the IPR at the University of Bath, and Rita will be presenting some slides on the research shortly. We're also joined by Jane Millar, who is a professor of social policy at the University of Bath, and Fran Bennett, who is a senior research fellow, part of the team at the Department of Social Policy and Intervention at the University of Oxford. And then finally, last, certainly not least, Alison Garnham, who is the Chief Executive of the Child Poverty Action Group, I'm sure many of you know very well. And Alison will be giving her thoughts on the project when we've had the presentations from our speakers. I need just to say a few words of housekeeping before we start. Cameras and microphones of participants are switched off. If you have a question, please do submit it via the chat function and we will try and respond to them all. The session is being recorded, and subject to no technical difficulties, we will put the session up online as a podcast at a later date, so you can come back to it. If you haven't seen the report, it's available on the IPR website at the University of Bath, so please just do go to our website. You can access it in full there to download. But that's probably enough from me by way of introduction. Thank you all for joining us. And I'm now going to pass to my colleague Jane Millar, hand over to Jane to introduce the research. Jane.
Thanks very much, Nick, and I'd like to add my welcome to everyone. It would be nice to be in the same room as you all, but unfortunately we can't do that. So hopefully we can still continue to have a good debate and discussion. So as Nick said, universal credit, a huge and radical policy change, merging 6 means-tested benefits for people in and out of work into one system. This is a new provision that affects the incomes and thus the living standards and the well-being of millions of people. Now, universal credit was announced 10 years ago, and the first claimants came onto the system in 2013. So we know quite a bit about how the system is working. But our project is the first independent, in-depth research to focus on couples claiming universal credit. Couples are currently about 15% of universal credit claimants. They're probably more in the upsurge that followed the COVID-19 lockdown. So they're about 15% at the moment, but by the time universal credit is fully operational, about half of all claimants will be couples. There'll be about 3 million couple households in the realm of universal credit. So our research, you might say, is a bit of a glimpse into the future, what's coming. And hopefully it will be helpful in highlighting some of the issues now so that problems and difficulties can be avoided. The project has 2 main research aims. The first aim was to examine how couples make decisions about money, work and care in this new universal credit environment. And the second was to explore what this means for gender roles within the household. We're going to be interviewing our sample again in September, looking at people's experiences over time. So that will be an opportunity also to look at the impact of the COVID-19 lockdown, as we'll have information both before and after that happened. But today we're focused on our first round of interviews, and I'd like to thank the ESRC who provided the funding for this project. Our sample includes 90 individual people, 90 participants in 53 households, receiving universal credit in 4 areas of England and Scotland. We actually have over 120 interviews because we interviewed most of the couples both jointly and individually. So we've got the perspectives of both the men and the women in the couples and their joint perspective. We also have a few former couples, lone parents, who can look back on their experience of claiming as a couple and reflect on that. We found our sample through a variety of means, including Facebook, community groups, snowballing, posters and job centres, and so on. What we aimed for and what we were able to get was a broad cross-section of claimants, including couples with different patterns of employment. So we've got no earners, we've got 1 earners, and we've got 2 earners. We sought to get people who'd been claiming universal credit for at least 6 months, so they weren't in that initial period where things need to settle down, and so we can pick them up past that initial claim period. My colleagues at Bath, Rita Griffiths and Marsha Wood, carried out all the interviews and the main analysis. And Rita is now going to take us through some of the research highlights. I'm going to pass over to Rita at this point.
Okay, thanks, Jane. If you just bear with me while I just load my slides. Okay, so can everybody see that? Yeah. Okay. So, just checking that that the slides are visible to everybody. Yeah, are the slides visible? Sorry.
Yes, they are.
They are, fine, sorry. Okay, so I want to start just by looking at why we're focusing on couples particularly, why it's different for couples, and then some highlights from the research. So it's a really extensive study. So we've only got time to focus on some of the key highlights, but we're focusing in on what we think are the important findings. The focus is very much on design and payment issues in this phase of research. So we're looking at the universal credit design and the way in which it impacts on money inside the household and budgeting in the couples. And as Jane explained, the phase 2 research is looking more at work, care decisions, and the conditionality regime in our follow-up interviews scheduled for September. So universal credit is really different for couples compared with single claimants and lone parents, because it's a really complex mix of individual and joint aspects. So there's a joint claim, there's a joint means test, so the income earnings of both members of the couple accounted for the joint means test. There's joint liability for debts, and yet the conditionality, the work conditionality, is individual. So each member of a couple has a claimant commitment with their own work requirements. There's only a single work allowance in a couple, which is the same amount that lone parents are entitled to. And most importantly, and what is unique about universal credit, is that there is only one payment per couple. And the other important thing is that this jointness, so this treatment of couples, is not elective. You can't choose to be treated separately. There is an obligation to be treated as a single benefit unit, as it's called, so that both members of the couple and any dependent children they have in the household is treated as a single unit. So necessarily this means that the decisions, behaviours, actions of one partner necessarily affects the other, and that's past and present as well, as we'll come on to see. So this was the starting point for the research. We were looking at how this context for making decisions about money and budgeting, work and care was actually impacting on the couple dynamic and on gender roles in this context. So financial issues were really to the fore in a lot of couples. They found that financially, they were often worse off claiming jointly compared with claiming separately. I should say that, that many of these issues about financial impacts of claiming jointly are also applied to the legacy system. So they're not exclusive to universal credit, but nevertheless, they impacted hugely in some cases on couples' financial circumstances, particularly if they'd been claiming benefits as individuals before they started living together. And the first issue is just that the couple allowance itself is less than double the amount that two single claimants would actually be entitled to. Secondly, that the joint means test, so including both partners in the means test, particularly earnings, could actually eliminate one partner's income. So if one partner is earning and the other was previously claiming, for example, as a lone parent, claiming as a couple would eliminate the lone parent's individual income by starting a joint claim. So partners also could inherit the debts and overpayments, tax credits and benefits from their partner as well. So this related both to overpayments in the benefit system, but also debts to third parties, including local authorities. So for example, council tax payments, sometimes related to a much earlier period of claiming when one member of the couple was actually in a previous partnership. So anything that that might still be owed and sitting on the system is brought into the current claim with the current partner and deducted automatically. Repayments are deducted automatically from the universal credit claim. Also mentioned previously, only one work allowance, which could disincentivize second earners in couples who are mainly women in most couples, although not all. And what most people felt was that the joint treatment, over which they had no choice, was very much out of step with norms around relationships and financial independence. For couples with children, the partners are required to nominate a lead carer. This is the person who has main responsibility for looking after children. The choice in our couples was largely determined by the existing work and care roles of the members of the male and female member of the couple. And so, unsurprisingly, lead carers were overwhelmingly female. So 27 lead carers were women and only 3 were men, because it reflected current arrangements in which it was more likely for the male partner to be working full time. And couples felt that that kind of could reinforce a notion of a male breadwinner. So it's harking back to a previous era that wasn't necessarily relevant. And they also mentioned the fact that the partner's parenting role is ignored in this regime. So it particularly also affects the conditionality regime. So while the lead carer has some flexibility around the number of hours they're required to work or to look for work, the other parent often is ignored and they're expected to work full time as though they have no children. And our couples didn't like that. They were saying that we're both our children's parents and we don't like being shoehorned into this division. So again, the policy wasn't seen to reflect contemporary norms around work and caring, and also the practicalities. We did have some couples who split work and parenting 50-50 down the middle. So it presented them with a real dilemma about who to nominate. One of the key aspects of universal credit that differentiates it from the previous system is that it's a lump sum monthly payment. So it's bringing in payments for adults and housing, children, if there are dependent children, and also childcare, if that's relevant, into a single monthly payment, which is paid with a monthly frequency. For couples used to being paid monthly or who had their tax credits paid for weekly previously, it had little or no impact, and often they said it ticks over quite nicely. So particularly if the universal credit payment came in at a different time of the month to the wages. So they were paid wages and then maybe 2 weeks later they would pay their universal credit. So that worked really well for some couples. But for couples who were more reliant on universal credit, so there were perhaps no other source of income, it was much more challenging for them to manage. Some of this was to do with just income inadequacy, so there wasn't enough money coming in through universal credit. Some of it was to do with the fact that there was no longer any labelling of the benefits, so particularly payments for children, that it was hard to differentiate between payments for children and the overall household budget. So it was also much riskier if the payment unexpectedly reduced or stopped. So the idea of all eggs being in one basket meant that if there was a problem, then it affected everything. There was often, it was, for couples with children, it was only child benefit that they could rely on sometimes if there was a problem they needed to challenge. And importantly as well, the separate benefits and tax credits in the previous system allowed each partner in the couple to have an income. So child tax credit was typically paid to the main carer, housing benefit paid to the person responsible for paying the rent, and adult benefits paid to, in the case of job seekers allowance, to the main job seeker. So, so each partner had an income. And the other issue was just having a monthly payment was more difficult to stretch the payment to last a month. And in all of this, often it's women who are more affected because they're much more likely to be money managers in low-income households. They were the ones at home, they were the ones struggling to make their payments stretch. Another key difference between universal credit and the legacy system, particularly tax credits, is that it's assessed monthly compared with an annual assessment which is paid with a regular fixed amount for tax credits. So again, some couples actually preferred this. It only really applied for couples who had earnings, because they're the ones whose assessment is likely to fluctuate from month to month. But some preferred it because it reduced the risk of overpayment. So only being paid on a monthly basis meant that they couldn't run up large overpayments that they then subsequently had to repay. And that had been an issue in the past for some. But for others, a monthly assessment sometimes created really unpredictable and large fluctuations in the payment that were really hard to understand in some cases because of the amount of fluctuation. So in some cases it would go from perhaps £800 down to £50, back up again, and often people wouldn't know in advance. So there's only a 7-day, with a monthly assessment, there's only a 7-day notice for a payment, which made it really difficult for couples, and again, it was mainly women, to know how much they were going to get paid, and that made budgeting really hard. There was a particular issue for two earner couples around technical issues about the way in which wages are captured in the monthly assessment. Now, this has been highlighted for lone parents, but for two earner couples, the effects were multiplied. So sometimes if wages were paid early, for example, due to a bank holiday or a weekend, sometimes 3 or 4 sets of earnings could be included in the monthly assessment. And when this happened, couples not only lost their payment of universal credit last month, but they could actually lose their entitlement altogether because it looked as though they'd been earning a huge amount, which took them outside of universal credit eligibility. And it was particularly relevant for couples who had childcare costs because childcare costs are included in the payment, and sometimes they actually lost their entitlement to childcare but still had the liability to pay them. And again, it was women who were disproportionately affected. They were more likely to be in receipt of the universal credit payment, they were more likely to be paying for childcare and juggling the finances and managing the claim overall. So it could be really quite stressful for them. So the key aspect of the payment regime in universal credit is that there's only one payment per couple. Sorry, click forward. 1 slide too many there. So the couple has to decide between them which partner or bank account is going to receive the payment. And in our research, just under 2/3 of payees were female, which broadly reflects the national statistics. 27% male, and we did have a small number of payments that were made into a joint account, and we had one couple that actually split the payment. There were actually very few joint accounts in our sample, particularly joint accounts where no other single account existed. So a few couples did have savings accounts, but in the main, it was the individual partners each had their own bank account. And actually joint accounts were seen as really risky by women because they were worried that what would happen if a partner accessed the joint money, what would happen if the relationship ended. So they really wanted to have their own bank accounts and their own financial autonomy, their own financial footprint, which is important for not just for claiming benefits in the future potentially, but also for applying for loans and credit and so on. So they were really keen about that. So even though they were sharing expenses and there were lots of joint aspects of money management, the actual way in which they kept control was by keeping their finances separate. Having said that, often the choice of bank account was really just a practical decision. So who went online first to make the claim, which account from or the rent and bills paid from, and who's better at managing finances. And in some couples who trusted one another, they were quite happy to make transfers between one another's accounts. E-banking apps allowed them to do that, although that didn't happen for all couples. Others specifically chose a partner who was not earning in order to give both an income. But we can't assume that just because there's one payment per couple that it goes to women, that it's actually unproblematic. Because it can still leave the other partner with no income, and men too had a sense of not wanting to be financially dependent on their partner. So it was seen to undermine the financial independence of the non-recipient partner, and could also undermine their money management skills as well. If again one person in the couple was taking all the responsibility for managing the single payment. There's still a risk of financial abuse as well with a single payment. And as I've mentioned a number of times, it's actually a heavy burden for women to carry. Often they were managing the single payment on top of often having a part-time job, managing their children, and also the childcare arrangements. So it was yet another task for women to do. They were doing all the kind of heavy lifting around the additional compliance that was attached to a universal credit claim. So for a whole variety of reasons, even though it may not have affected them personally or them as a couple, most couples felt that paying a separate amount to each partner, if that could be achieved, was much safer and fairer to everybody. And a lot of these issues about how couples manage their relationships, how they manage their finances, are all are going to be more relevant to the COVID-19 cohort. A lot of these issues are going to be brought into much sharper focus. So at that point, I'm going to pass over to my colleague, Fran, who will continue.
Hello, can everybody hear me all right? Rita's about the only one who can say yes. Okay, I was going to look at the policy implications of our research. So we do realise that at the moment it's a crisis with the coronavirus pandemic and that the government is rather busy on other things. But we also think that the issues that are affecting couples will be thrown into sharp relief by the coronavirus pandemic because so many more couples are coming onto universal credit. And for some, that will be quite a shock because of the various elements of its features that Rita has been talking about. So although our report reinforces the findings of others about some of the issues with universal credit, we also think that it makes the case for more consideration to be given to couples in particular and their position in relation to universal credit. And in particular, that's because some of its rules and the way in which it's designed run counter, we think, to current norms amongst many families and the way in which they live today. But also it's because couples are affected more by some of the design features of universal credit than other people are. And now is the time to address those because of the greater numbers coming onto universal credit as a result of the pandemic. So the first one of those we'd highlight is what Rita was talking about in terms of the element for couples being lower than the equivalent for two single people. Now, that is not new. That's the case for means-tested benefits in general, and it's meant to recognise economies of scale. But the coronavirus crisis has led to an uplift of some £20 a week in universal credit standard allowances. And that has meant that the £20 a week goes to single people, and the extra £20 a week goes to couples as well. And that moves the relativities between singles and couples, to make it worse, relatively speaking, for couples. So we think the time is right for a review of the relativities between singles and couples in particular, because of the uplift due to the coronavirus pandemic. The other issue which came across very strongly, I think, in what Rita said, was about access to some income for both members of the couple being seen as safer and fairer. And of course, before the means-tested benefits, all these 6 benefits and tax credits were put together, there was the opportunity for, in quite a lot of couples, for one person to get some of the income and the other to get some of it as well. And that's more difficult now because of universal credit. And we think that there should be arrangements so that couples can have some of the universal credit each, rather than it having to go to one specific account. Scotland, of course, is thinking about how to do this at the moment. We also think that that doesn't necessarily mean financial independence as such for either partner, because as Rita said, the way in which universal credit and other means-tested benefits work is that the income and the needs and the actions of your partner, of course, affects the amount of resources that you get as well. So it's important to recognise that universal credit is not the only benefit in the social security system, and that it's really important to protect other benefits and to increase them, particularly those that give some financial independence for women who find it more difficult to do that. The other way in which, of course, people can have financial independence is through wages. And one of the issues that we will look at more in the second phase of our research, but that did come through to some extent in this, is that second earners, so-called, do not have as good incentives as first earners in couples to earn some money of their own. And we'll be having a look at some of the issues there, and we'd like the government to review those as well and see how incentives can be improved for so-called second earners in couples. We did have, however, have some two-earner couples in our research, and they were particularly affected by 2 issues which have come through from other people as well, and in fact were the subject of a court case today which found against the government in terms of how universal credit and earnings payments interact. So if you have 2 earners in a couple, then the volatility of your income can be greater if you're on universal credit, because you may have several different payments of earnings within the month, and those may come at different times one month from the next month, and therefore they will affect your universal credit and make it more volatile, more unpredictable than it would if it was just one earner with payment period that was just one lot of wages. So 2 earner couples find that even more difficult. And the other thing that 2 earner couples, and it should be said lone parents as well, suffer from is having to pay childcare costs up front. And for earners, that made quite a difference to their income, and people found it quite hard to cope with that, and some were actually tempted to or had to give up work or paid childcare because of that. So that's another thing we think the government should be looking at. We did find, as you'll have heard from Rita, that women were affected more across many features of universal credit than men were. And we think this does mean that more attention should be given to the features in universal credit, which may exacerbate the risk of abusive or controlling relationships having an impact, but also that we should be looking at the situation of partnered women more generally. I've already talked about access to income of both partners, and the fact that universal credit is not the only benefit we should be looking at, but also we'd like to see a review of the administrative and compliance burden on payments, because that was much more likely, as Rita said, to fall on women, and it really was no let up, as the report says, for some women, that they were both administering the universal credit claim on behalf of the couple, and they were also trying to manage the household budget, and they might also have had part-time work and childcare as well. And we think the time is ripe to look at how much administrative and compliance costs there is on claimants of universal credit, which particularly fell on the women. So those are some of the policy ideas that we think come out of the report, which deserve a good look by the government. I now want to hand on to Alison Garnham, who's the Chief Executive of the Child Poverty Action Group, and who's kindly agreed to give us some comments on the research today.
My role, I think, is to comment on this study and kind of draw more kind of conclusions about it. And the sorts of things I want to look at are the issue of increased generosity, which we've recently experienced, the fact that policy is personal, and the fact that there are still serious flaws that need to be tackled in universal credit. My comments are sort of informed by our early warning system at CPAG, where we collect cases from the front line about what's going wrong, and we do mind the gaps briefings fortnightly. So my first general comment is really that, of course, everybody's pleased that universal credit hasn't fallen over. It's a really good sign, especially following the very slow rollout and the risk facing those who would have been worse off on universal credit because it was rolling out cuts. But there's been a huge rise in claims of payments, 9 times the pre-crisis rate of claims, and as many claims in 4 weeks as in the 9 months of the previous recession, 40% rise in universal credit awards. But the fact it hasn't fallen over, it seems to me, is a pretty low bar. When unemployment rose by 3.5 million in the early 1980s, unemployment benefit didn't fall over either, and you were paid in 14 days. But implementation is often the most neglected part of policy development, so it's very important it works. And I think one obvious lesson to draw is that you need extra staff, and that's one of the things that seems to have worked. As Fran's pointed out, the increased generosity, the additional £20 and more help with local housing allowance has been hugely welcome, but of course it works out less for couples. But of course generosity could go a long way to smoothing over some of the cracks. But I don't think that's an excuse for not dealing with the other aspects of universal credit, which are deeply flawed. And I think this report reveals the practical day-to-day issues that arise for families. The other kind of good news is that lots of people are managing okay. Not surprisingly, they tend to be people with more steady incomes and more computer savvy. For those it's not working for, it can be a nightmare. And actually, even the Resolution Foundation study, which was broadly positive about universal credit, said that those managing to claim okay were still experiencing real hardship. 34% were reporting trouble keeping up with bill payments, 42% had to cut back on spending. And of course, the 5-week wait is unmanageable for most people, and the recoverable loan is, of course, debt. On top of the other regular deductions made from universal credit, it can leave people very short. So my conclusion, policy is personal. I think this study reveals that very well. And there's a whole series of things, as Fran says, that are either transferred from pre-existing means-tested benefits, and some are new to universal credit that are problematic. The idea of one payment into a household, for example, when 75% of mothers are in paid work these days. It's a bit like sort of 1950s male wage earner model. In normal households, there's money coming in from different sources. The lack of split payments can make people vulnerable. It's not normal to be asking your partner for income. Monthly assessment and payment, with people paid for weekly still being capped, drives a coach and horses through the way people normally budget. The lack of a second earner work allowance, which, given the huge growth in women's employment before the crisis and more women now losing jobs, it's a bad idea to create such poor work incentives for second earners in universal credit. Why do we need a main earner and a second earner in the first place? Really, we need 2 3/4 time earners. It doesn't reflect the real world. And monthly reporting and payment of childcare costs in arrears is a huge problem for many families. 2 things that haven't come up so far is benefit cap and 2-child policy. The rationale for both of these policies is now redundant. The benefit cap is excluding people from the £20. Again, we're getting a lot of these cases reported to us at CPAG. We know that most capped households are lone parents, 3/4 have children, 1/3 of them have children so young they're not required to work. So the idea that this is still needed as an incentive to move into paid work under lockdown is extremely odd and needs to go. And the 2-child policy, of course, it would have been impossible to plan family size, as is the kind of policy rationale, making the same decisions as people in work, when no one could have known that COVID-19 was around the corner. It also, of course, as the benefit cap does, discriminates against Black minority ethnic families. And of course, one of the things that's coming up a lot now in our reports is contributory benefit entitlement being sidelined, which has also been referred to. First, there's been the reduction to 1 year's entitlement, and now people are being sort of encouraged away by the prospect of higher universal credit entitlement. And it's something that we're working with DWP on. So a lot of this I've been calling sort of discrimination by design, and I think the reality is showing that that is the case. Digital applications is an issue. Claimants not being able to understand how their award is broken down. It's hard to see what decisions have been made and therefore work out whether there's a right of appeal. Statements of rights are hard to find. So digital decision making needs a thorough review, or we call it computer says no. It certainly needs to be made more transparent. But the recent practice of follow-on calls recently is a real improvement, and I think that needs to be retained, I think, as others have said. So I think the key point from the study is that this is worst for the most vulnerable families. The reality of deductions on top of an award that's hard to understand, monthliness, managing claims, non-splitting of elements, the main earner idea make living with universal credit difficult in practice, and more difficult if you have fragile income. In research we carried out in Tower Hamlets, many families said that they preferred the tax credits regime because it gave them greater predictability of income. And they didn't understand monthly reassessment as a work incentive as is intended by the universal credit policy. What they really felt was that they were face to face with a poverty trap each month, and they were able to articulate that. Why earn more when it's just going to be taken away? But that's the reality of this kind of means testing. A lot of the problems shown in this study stem from aggregation rules transported from pre-existing means-tested approaches. So I think one of the things we need to look at is how you get a sort of reinvigoration perhaps of our contributory system. It was never really debated with the public whether they wanted to move to a huge single means test in the way that we have. And when we talk to the public, as we've done recently in a citizens' jury, they seem to prefer contributory approaches. So final learning points from me is I think we need to think more about how to create greater independence of income, whether through separating out amounts in universal credit and paying to each partner, or reinvesting in contributory benefits, which the public like and can provide an independent source of income. Generosity is a huge point. Historically, our replacement rates on benefits are very low, on average for unemployed people, half of in-work income. So we need to work hard to try and keep the additional generosity in the system with the £20 payments. And we need to restore more non-means tested sources of support, and I think starting with child benefit. We can't ever see, I don't think, child benefit folded into universal credit. And I think it's absolutely crucial. Families need more certainty and reliability of income, fewer changes, longer payment periods and individual assessments. And finally, I think we can't forget the crucial role of second earners in the reduction of child poverty. We need second earner disregards and employment support for parents, lone parents and second earners. And I'll leave it there.
Great. Well, thank you very much indeed, Alison, for those really important comments on the report and on some of the other contemporary questions, as you say, the two-child policy, the benefit cap, a number of other issues, 5-week wait and so on. Thank you to Rita, to Jane and to Fran. We have some questions that have come in to you about the report. I'm going to start with one from Alan Marsh, who asks what the purpose of nominating a lead childcare is. Is it simply to identify which partners will be hit by sanctions for non-compliance with job seeking or failure to try to improve earned income? So a question there, what is the purpose of the lead childcare policy, nominating a lead childcare? And then a second question, perhaps take two to start. This is from Mark, who's done work on UC in Northern Ireland with Ruth Patrick. And the question here really is about monthly payments and whether people struggled with receiving housing costs directly into their accounts. Would they have preferred direct payments to landlords? A policy question that's been there for UC for a long time now. And obviously in Northern Ireland and Scotland, that provision does exist. So a question there about whether people would prefer direct payments of their housing costs to their landlords. And Mark ends with the question, how hard did we have to look in this research to find any positive experiences? There was some mention, but how hard did we have to look? So perhaps, Rita, I could start with you. Perhaps you could answer from those questions.
So the question about the lead carer policy is basically to do with the conditionality regime. Principally, it's about allowing lead carers with children to have more flexibility around the that they're required to work or to job search, and it's basically it's a duplication, if you like, of the policy that previously applied to lone parents. Prior to universal credit, the dependent partner, as they were known in couples with children, had no work-related requirements, or they were very minimal in comparison to universal credit. So it's very much linked to the conditionality regime around couples with children.
Thanks, Rita. Fran, Jane, did we touch on this question of housing costs and direct payments?
Well, I think asking about the actual findings in the report in terms of monthly payments of housing costs and how many were having them direct to landlords would probably be better going to Rita, just because she lives this all the time. Could I just come back on the lead carer one briefly, which is to say that, of course, the purpose of universal credit from the start was that it was very much couched in the framework of workless households, and in particular workless families with children, and therefore the emphasis was always on one main earner in the household rather than necessarily two. So the priority was to get one person into work, and therefore, if you like, that goes with the idea that one person would have responsibility for the children and the other would have no recognition within their conditionality that they have children at all, as Rita said. So the person who's the lead carer is treated as though they were a lone parent, actually, as though they were looking after children on their own. And the other person is the person to whom the priority is given for getting the family out of worklessness. And that was very much, as I remember, the motivation behind universal credit. But I think the housing costs and how many people had housing costs direct to the landlord is probably better for Rita.
Yeah, I can reply to that. I think was it Mark who asked the question?
Yeah.
Yeah. It very much depended. So one of the key differences was whether the tenant was with a social housing provider or whether it was with a private landlord, because that was then reflected in how much entitlement people got towards their housing costs. So in cases where their tenancy was with a social landlord, then paying the rent direct was often, it took the worry away because it was often paid in full. However, there were some technicalities around the frequency and nature of the payment, which meant that some people were technically always in arrears. They were always kind of trying to catch up because of the way in which monthly assessment worked. And that, again, was an added stress. So people were constantly getting letters, automated letters saying that they were in arrears when it was just to do with the way in which the monthly assessment worked. So it didn't necessarily take the stress away. And for other people who had private landlords, I think the issue there was people wanting the control because they couldn't rely on the system paying on their behalf. So often they were kind of cut out of the loop, the actual claimants themselves. So they didn't know how much was being paid, whether it's being paid in its entirety. And so often people did prefer to, well, as soon as their universal credit payment came in, the first thing that often couples did was to pay their rent in full and then just try to manage on whatever was left. So they knew they always had a roof over their heads, and that was a priority for nearly all the couples that we interviewed.
And Nick, just on the, did we have to search hard for good news in the sample, which is Mark's question, which is a good one. One of the things about our sample was we tried to get a sample of people with a range of experiences. So we weren't trying to pick up people who presented with problems to fight agencies or anything like that. It was a diverse sample. And as you say, we had people in lots of different employment experiences. I think many of the couples that we talked to, I mean, universal credit is a source of income and it's important from that point of view. I mean, it's topping up wages or people are living on it as their entire income. So in terms of the positives of it, having a source of income was an important thing. I think that the other thing, and I think it's already been mentioned, was that for people whose circumstances were relatively stable and who were in the right sort of site, universal credit's basically be designed for a particular type of person. And if you're that type of person, it can work for you. So if you're in a secure situation, your monthly wages don't change, you're good at IT and you prefer to use IT, because some people do, they like the online claiming and so on, then it is going to work for you. But that's who it's been designed for. The problem is there are a lot of people who don't fit those circumstances, and the design, they have to try and fit themselves around it rather than the other way around.
If I could just jump in there and just add that the couples that really got a good experience, sort of following on from what Jane said, were in the main tended to be single earner couples, where quite traditional, where there was a male full-time earner and the female partner was at home caring for children. And because she was in receipt usually of the universal payment, it was basically replacing the previous child tax credits. And that tended to work well. It was stable, as Jane said, they could rely on it. It wasn't a volatile payment in the same way. But for dual earner couples, and that was very much a surprise for us because we expected people sort of upper end of eligibility would have quite a good experience, but because they were more likely to be subject to this huge variation, and also because of the way that incentives are now geared towards single earner couples. So some of them lost out financially as well when there were two earners. But there were some couples that had a good experience. And you know, there are plenty of examples in the report. It's not all just bad news.
Great, thank you, Rita. So we have a few more questions now. The first is on research methodology, which is from Sarah Hughes, which is thinking ahead to the next phase of the research. How will you analyse the care employment decision-making process? So the decisions between care and employment. Will you draw on any particular frameworks for that, or perhaps use vignettes to explore the decision-making process? So research methodology question there. Then a question from Joe Abbas in, Joe, I think you're probably in Norway, if you can hear me, in Bergen. How do, and I think this is the government, how does the government interpret the design flaws identified in the study? Or how do we researchers identify the design flaws? Are they deliberate, such as the disincentives for second earners? Are they deliberate, or are they the result of lack of understanding, or accidental? I suppose if you were Ian Duncan Smith, you'd say I had a perfect design, and then the Treasury just chopped all the resources, and so we've ended up where we are. And then related to that, I think, coming back to the points perhaps that Alison was making, perhaps Alison, I could bring you in with Jane as well on these questions. This balance, you were talking about contributory benefits and public support for the idea of contribution. Obviously, in our system, we have some residual contributory elements in our social security. We have means testing, and we've just been discussing universal credit and means testing, and we have some elements of universality. Obviously, child benefit, and some would argue that the basic state pension is becoming almost like a universal income payment. And I just wonder whether the experience of COVID might lead to a shift between those different elements, and in particular whether the fact that people can't attend in person for interviews and so on, that some of the kind of sanctions regime may disappear and some elements of more universality may be accepted, as well as perhaps some of the holes in the social security system that have been exposed by the crisis might lead people to think that they want to go to a system that's either got more contribution in it or more universality, but doesn't have the same elements of conditionality or people's employment status passporting them through to benefits that they then aren't able to obtain. So perhaps if I could, Rita, could ask you to do the first question on the methodology for the next phase.
The research methods, yeah. So our first phase was very much geared towards getting different perspectives. So from each of the partners, we had an individual interview, and then we were doing an interview where the couple came together and were interviewed by a researcher. So that's a really good way of getting to work her decisions, because each partner is answering questions without the knowledge and the involvement of the other partner, but then we're also doing a joint interview. And we've got all that data available to us. So we have analysed it. It's just not been written up because we wanted to combine that then with our second phase of research. So what's happened with COVID-19 is that we are no longer able to use that methodology. I should have said as well that all our interviews were done in people's homes. So we would go into people's homes and get a really good feel for the dynamic of people's relationships and just the circumstances that families find themselves in. We're not going to be able to do that at all in phase 2. We're going to have to switch to virtual methods and telephone methods. Sadly, we will have to abandon, we think, a joint interview because it's just not going to work using Zoom or a telephone interview. But we've got really good data from our first phase, which we'll be combining. So the other issue is that it will be longitudinal, so we will be able to track those couples over time, looking at the work care decisions they were making in the first phase before COVID, and also after COVID as well, because obviously they've impacted, the issues around COVID have impacted massively on families with children and on women as well in particular. I don't know if colleagues would like to add to that at all.
Yeah, Fran, Jane, I mean,
please do also. Do you want us to go on to the? Do you want us to go on to the other question about
yes, I think,
policy and design, or?
Yes, Fran. Yeah, please do, Fran. Yeah, that would make sense. I think. Yeah.
I don't know whether others would want to add about that one, but just to say, I do think that the policy aims for universal credit are important in the design, so that I think a lot of it is not accidental, but that if you, for example, prioritize the transition into work, so you prioritize people going from out of work to in work, which was seen to be a particular problem area because of people having to stop claiming one benefit and then claim another. If you prioritize that, and therefore you think you have to put benefits for those out of work and those in work together to make that transition smoother, then that gives you, for example, some policy rigidities, which mean that you are then having to treat people in and out of work in the same way in some ways, and therefore you can't tweak benefits for people out of work versus or benefits for people in work in certain ways that would be particularly beneficial for those groups. Similarly, if you decide that you need to simplify the benefit system and therefore you want to put together not just benefits for those in and out of work, but also benefits for income maintenance, if you like, so to give you an income, and benefits which meet specific costs like childcare or housing costs. Similarly, you then introduce some policy rigidities, because if you put everything together, then there's a limited range of things that you can do which are specific to those kinds of areas and would be particularly helpful for those kind of areas. So, for example, we used to have different taper rates for withdrawing different benefits, and we used to withdraw them in a certain order when you increased your wage income. We used to leave child tax credits to last to withdraw, so you left the main carer with some benefit. You can't do that if you're paying everything at once and it's one system. And in order to achieve some other policy aims, which included, and included this quite deliberately, saving on administration, you try to make the system as automated as possible. And therefore, some ways in which the claimants felt that things were not personalised, as Alison was talking about, things which they didn't understand but were sort of decided somewhere else by an automated system, flow from that decision that you want to save money on administering the system. So I think a lot of that was is an inevitable consequence of the policy priorities that you set for the new system.
Thank you, Fran.
That as well, which is, I think that's all true. Also, I think what was missing, though, in the original design was the importance of security. I don't think they were taking sufficient account of understanding that changing people's income all the time in the way that universal credit does, and Alison described it as face-to-face with the poverty trap every month. I don't think it was recognised that that was such a big issue. I mean, it seems it wasn't recognised that making people wait 5 weeks for any money was going to be problematic for a lot of people. And it also wasn't realised that you need some security in income. People need predictability. They need to know how much they're getting. It's important. The amount you get is important, but also knowing how much you're going to get and that you're going to get it regularly is very important, and that was missing. Can I say a bit, Alison, I'm sure I want to say more, but just a bit about the wider policy things. I mean, the big increase in the numbers coming on to universal credit recently could mean that universal credit becomes more embedded in the system and actually becomes, it's a sort of acceleration of the migration that wasn't happening and was very much slowed down. So there's a risk, of course, that it becomes more embedded there. But I think it's also true that we're already beginning to see some of the problems that these new cohort are facing. One being that the main reason why people are being turned down, but they're not eligible for any universal credit, is because of their partner earnings, i.e. they're facing up straight away to the fact that there's a household means test here. So someone who loses their job and thinks that they can get some support from the state because they've lost their job through no reason of their own may find that they're not entitled because they're in a means system where their family income is taken into account. The conditionality side, I think the removal of some of the conditionality requirements at the moment is very important, and there's a very good case for saying that you can't, in periods of high unemployment, have a rigid conditionality regime where you employ heavy sanctions for people who are looking for jobs in circumstances where they're going to find it very difficult to find work. And I'm sure Alison will want to add more on policy.
Yes, if I can. I think it's interesting, isn't it, that from the work that you've done, you might conclude that it's working better as a wage subsidy for sort of slightly better off, steady earning people than it is for its original intention, which was helping people with the transition from out of work to in work, where people are, especially if they've been on universal credit longer, more fragile, can't manage the change, and they're finding it very difficult to manage universal credit altogether. So that's quite interesting. The other thing is about, in terms of what's deliberate, I remember early discussions in the design phase of universal credit when ministers were being asked about second earner disregards and main wage earner ideas, and they were quite clear that they were deeply relaxed about the idea of universal credit being a benefit that gets one worker into work. Which and at the time, you know, I think IFS had recently put out a document saying that the biggest rise in paid employment, you know, in sort of rise in living standards in families had come from women joining the labour market. So it was a pretty batty sort of place to be politically on universal credit. I think more recently, the idea about sort of big shifts in policy on social security, I think the fact that Rishi Sunak has introduced sort of like a European style sort of continental 80% replacement of earnings in the job retention scheme is very interesting, and there's been no flack or fallout about that or complaint that it's too generous. I think that does create a real opportunity to look again at generosity of the benefits system, and whether we shouldn't be thinking about, you know, as they do on the continent, 6 or 12 months at a much higher rate of benefit, rather than plunging people into the depths of poverty. Instantly they lose their job, like we do at the moment, although £20 better than before. And I think that the other thing that I hope will change is that we now all have seen the faces of the low-paid workers who are holding our country together. And, you know, 7 out of 10 poor children live with working parents. So poverty today is about being in work. So we now know who those people are. They seem to be terribly useful. And you know, a changed understanding about what low income is about in this country would be enormously helpful, and an understanding that there's not a group of people who are sort of takers and another group who are contributors, but everyone is contributors, but some people are still very much worse off than others.
Thank you very much, Alison. And the point you make about the job retention scheme is something that would have been unimaginable, I think, in British policymaking until this crisis, that you'd have a very continental style of intervention of that kind to keep people for the state to pay the wages, 80% of the wages of nearly 9 million people, I think. So it's huge.
Exactly.
I've got 2 more questions, if I may. So from Kate Summers asking about DWP policies that were designed to protect claimants that can't receive standard UC payments, i.e. an option to have the split payments between couples, or to have some kind of money management intervention. Did these come up in the sample, and how did participants access these alternative arrangements? How did they find them? So that's the first question. And then the second one from Carl Hanscom. Carl says, you have mentioned families struggling with not knowing what UC award to expect each month because of earnings frequency and debt repayments and more. But the monthly payment of UC was justified at the start to encourage people to manage their money. With your research, was there acknowledgement of this being the expectation of universal credit, i.e. put some money aside if you received a bit more? Or do claimants still expect the welfare state to fit around their lives? And now we've done this national experiment, how likely is it that claimants will get good enough at managing their money to deal with the fluctuations of UC? Or are more frequent payments and assessments essential? So the monthly payment, and whether it's people were aware of what it was being designed to achieve, and whether we now need a different kind of system. But perhaps Rita, we could start you with those questions.
Yeah, about the split payment.
Yeah.
Yeah, so split payments are by exception. So it's only in very exceptional circumstances that they are granted. So you don't have a right to request one out of choice. And only, I think nationally, I think at the last count it was 86. At the last time data was produced, 86 couples nationally had a split payment. So really tiny numbers. I mean, and even where there is abuse taking place, we had some examples in our research where a split payment had been requested and turned down. So there are issues there, but also if a woman is in an abusive relationship and is still living with her abuser, it can be an added risk to actually request a single payment. So it's a very risky policy. It's certainly not a solution. And I think, as Fran will confirm, it's a hugely complex issue, actually, how you split or separate payments. The Women's Budget Group has done a lot of work, and the Scottish Government as well, and they're still grappling with the issue. So it's really not that straightforward.
Thank you, Rita. And Fran and Jane, I mean, perhaps this question of, you know, from Carl, you know, did people internalise what they thought the policy was trying to make them do to manage their money over a month? And did they acknowledge that? And you know, if it really doesn't work, you know, what's the sort of alternative? Is it to go to annual payments again, or to go to annual assessments, I should say, or some other kind of frequency of payments?
Do you want to go first, Jane, or?
I find that people need to be taught how to manage their money rather a bit off in a way. I mean, you know, people were managing their money. We're talking to people who, a lot of them earning couples who are quite used to managing their finances, and people who are used to managing, living on sometimes very low incomes and making it work. What people struggle with is a change in that payment regime for some people. So it didn't fit with the ways in which they had devised to manage their money. So they had systems, but those systems weren't necessarily lined up well with universal credit. And of course, the other side of it is, particularly for the people who were relying on universal credit as their only source of income, and families with children, is there enough money? You can do as much managing of your money as you like. If you haven't got enough money, you're still going to fall into problems and fall into debts and so on. So people were making choices, yes, about how they would spend their money and what they would prioritize. But they were, in some cases, forced to do in the circumstances where it was just, they were just not going to have enough money to make it work. So I sometimes find the idea that people need to be taught to manage their money well, somewhat on the patronizing side, actually, and particularly for people in a range of these circumstances.
And you can see that the legacy system for different people, I mean, obviously it depends what benefits you're claiming and so on, but you get signals. So you might call them nudges these days. You get signals that this benefit is for this purpose. So here's some housing benefit. This benefit is child tax credit and child benefit. This is for your children. And we had claimants who said, I don't know now which is meant to be for me and which is meant to be for the children. You also had in the legacy system some choice and control if you were on tax credits of how often you wanted to be paid. So you could be paid weekly or you could be paid 4 weekly. And child benefit has also got some arrangements whereby you can be paid weekly in certain circumstances. So you have more kind of choice and flexibility over what suits you, if you like, and things are labelled and they're kind of ring fenced in that sort of way, and they're paid to different people within the household, and they're paid more frequently. Then you take all that away and you say, we're going to give you one undifferentiated lump sum payment once a month, and you say, if you need some help budgeting, we'll give you some budgeting help. It seems to me that you take away all the nudges and all the helps that were given, and then you say budgeting advice instead. Doesn't seem to me a hugely good deal. And one of the things that I think we could have said earlier and should say is that some of the, you were asking about policy and whether it was deliberate and so on, that some of the things which don't work here might have worked better had claimants been talked to more, and had claimants had more input into the design of universal credit. There are some things like the poverty trap, for example, which in a modelling sense may seem as though they work very well. But actually, if you are a family living with universal credit that where 63% of the universal credit is taken away at the end of every month, rather than you having a platform to build on as you did with tax credits, for example, it doesn't feel the same as it is when it's modelled at all. It feels very different from the old situation. So I think if we'd had more input from claimants into the system, then there might have been fewer of these decisions made.
Thank you very much, Fran. Alison, I just wanted to ask you a couple of questions. We haven't really talked about childcare as much, although it came up in the presentation from the research that Rita made at the beginning, that people find it very hard to make the upfront payments to childcare providers, and also that it's incredibly difficult to plan the childcare for your children if you don't know what resources you're going to be given and you don't know how they're identified for childcare on a month-to-month basis. And I'm I'm wondering whether this research and also what's happening in the crisis at the moment, with lots of vulnerability for childcare providers saying they can't survive the period at the moment without some, the fee income, whether the argument is made that actually childcare costs will be better being taken out of universal credit or being paid through those kind of, if you like, demand side, and rather like the payments for places for 3 and 4 year olds paid directly to the supplier, to the schools, the nurseries, the childcare providers. I mean, is that something that you think from your work you would support?
Oh, definitely, yes. I think it's kind of the missing piece of the jigsaw is getting a proper universal childcare system running, and I definitely think it would be better for it to have supply side funding. And that's not just for nurseries, but also for extended schools, because the big gaps in childcare these days are in childcare for older children, for children with disabilities, for parents working atypical hours. And those would be better dealt with through, again, a supply side funded system of extended school, sort of before and after school and throughout the school holidays. It would also incidentally help you to address the food issue, because it could just be available for all kids and without having to have these stigmatizing child feeding programs that we're developing at the moment. So yeah, supply side is definitely the way ahead, and of course steps along the way could include, while you're expanding that, then obviously universal credit entitlements would eventually shrink. At the moment, making the monthly reporting is a real headache. There's never been a successful way of providing upfront payments. There used to be advisory discretionary fund, and now there's the flexible fund. These are so poorly known by parents and not advertised that people don't know to ask in order to get help with that kind of thing. So people start out in debt, then they have to claim in arrears through universal credit, and so that leaves them often in debt with their childcare providers, which is no way to manage a relationship with your child's carer, educator, whatever you want to call them. So yeah, I think more needs to be done.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Alison. Well, I think we've come to the end of the questions we have, unless anybody wants to put one in now whilst I'm speaking. But thank you to those of you who have asked those questions before in the previous session. I might just ask, if I may, our team to say anything more at the end, if there's anything that we haven't covered in this Q&A that you wanted particularly to reflect upon. I know that there are more papers coming. I mentioned at the beginning that the report is available on the IPR website, and you're going into the further research, but there will be more papers being published. I know my colleague Marsha Wood, who Jane mentioned earlier, who's on the call, has done work in particular on the childcare issue. So it may be worth just signposting people to any further developments, further resources that will come from the research. Perhaps I can ask you to do that by way of closing the debate today.
Shall I start? Yes. So the report is published, and we encourage everyone to read it, of course. And we are currently working on the plan for the fieldwork for the phase 2. So we're developing that side of things. We obviously had a lot of presentations, conference papers, and all sorts of things planned, most of which have been postponed or not happening. So we're looking to put forward some more events, a bit more targeted events, and more publications. So more blogs, articles as well, and more a wider range of publications, because we want to reach out as far as possible. And we're very interested to continue to talk to third sector and policymakers about the implications of the research.
Great. Thank you, Jane. Good. Okay, well, if that's everything from everybody, a big thank you to Alison, first of all, for coming on to the event today and providing your comments. And we're very grateful to you, Alison. It's really important to have your perspectives. And, we know this is a very busy time for you, although you mentioned there are lots of issues that need to be addressed. You've now got Marcus Rashford on your side, which is a rather useful thing to have in in politics. Some of the talent that he's got is not confined to the football pitch. But thank you very much, Alison. That's great. And thank you to Jane and to Fran and to Rita for your presentations and for answering the questions so fully. And thank you to everybody who has come on this call and has engaged with this research. As Jane mentioned, we encourage you to go onto our website, to read our blogs, to look at the work as we continue with it, to stay in touch with us, because there will be more to come on this incredibly important area. And if policy remains fluid because of this crisis, then we will be seeking to influence it, as we've done today, to make the kind of improvements that we've discussed that are necessary. So thank you very much, everybody. Thank you for coming on the call today. And as I say, do keep in touch with our work in the future. Thank you.